May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. So our readings today are familiar to many of us. We usually encounter the stories of the widows when our readings are used as examples of generous giving. When we focus on stewardship and our generosity in our stewardship campaigns. The widow we encounter with Elijah in Kings is told to give all that she has to eat and drink to the prophet. This is the last meal for her and her son. But the prophet persists and ultimately reveals that God will not let her jar of meal nor her jug of oil go empty. And alas, we see in the story of the widow with Elijah that through our giving of our all, we open ourselves to the abundance of God. We encounter our second widow in the gospel, as Jesus is in the midst of all the activity in the temple. He first warns his followers of the scribes because of their focus on prestige, and they sought preferential treatment in the synagogues and in the marketplace. And he specifically mentions that the scribes devour widows' houses. He then moves on to sit across from the treasury, taking notice of those putting money into the treasury. And amongst all this activity, he notices a poor widow who offers up all that she has out of her poverty, all that she has to live on. This story is used to show that while others were giving out of their abundance, this poor widow was giving all that she had. She was giving out of what she herself needed. So who can argue when these stories of these widows are used at stewardship time as examples of giving all you can of your time, your talent, and your treasure? They remind us not just to give out of our abundance as the rich did, but remind us to give more generously out of our need. But taking another look can reveal another part of the story, another part that is often hidden from view, when stewardship giving is our central reason for telling the story. To see it, we need to understand the circumstances of the widows. In those times, that the widows were very vulnerable, especially if they did not have any sons with which they could live after the death of her husband. Widows at this time who did not have any sons were at the mercy of the religious leaders, specifically at the mercy of the scribes, in the practice of scribal trusteeship of the estate of the widows. Scribes were the trustees of the estates of widows with no sons, since they were not entrusted to manage the affairs of their deceased husbands. It was a practice, however, that was notorious for embezzlement and abuse. So when Jesus is noticing the widow in the midst of the scribes and others in the temple, it is to take notice of someone who is powerless amidst those who would portray power and prestige, the scribes. He portrays a comparison between the scribes, those with power, and those who are powerless because of their dependence on them. And saying that the scribes devour widows' houses, he's pointing at the difference of power as well as the effect one had on one another. Now, what are we to get out of this story, which recognizes the powerless widow in the midst of the powerful scribes? What is Jesus trying to get us to understand? I think the first thing is to encourage us to take notice, to recognize those among us who are powerless, to be aware of those around us and the dynamic of power amongst those around us. Jesus, of course, in other readings has said to pay attention to the least among us, to recognize that many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. To recognize those who are suffering due to being powerless at the hands of those who are powerful. So I think the first thing for us is to be awake, to be aware, to notice those around us, to recognize those who are powerless in our midst, as Jesus did in the temple. I think the second thing is for us to ask, what do we do when we notice those in our midst who are powerless? And I think the answer to that question is found in what we profess each time we renew our baptismal covenant. When we answer the questions, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? And will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? To which we say, I will, with God's help. I think these two questions put forth how we are to treat those who we recognize to be powerless among us. Those two questions call us to see Christ in all people, to love them as we love ourselves, to strive for justice for all people, and to respect the dignity of every person. Those two questions remind us of who we are, that we are a community that is seeking to build and be beloved community, and to remind ourselves of who we are each time we remind ourselves of our baptismal vows. So maybe it's right for us to see the stories of the widows when we consider stewardship. When we understand stewardship to be defined as supervising or managing something, we can perhaps ask, what is it we are supervising or managing? Perhaps when we see stewardship not simply related to the use of our time, our talent, and our treasure, but rather related to our image and understanding who we are. A reminder that we are people of a baptismal covenant with God and one another. Perhaps that is a better understanding of stewardship, that we are responsible for understanding who we are as people of a baptismal covenant, who reaffirm and remind ourselves who we are each and every time we renew our vows. Every time we baptize a new member into that covenant and into this community. Every time we affirm and remind ourselves that our covenant with God and one another calls us to love others as ourselves, to strive for justice for all people, and to respect the dignity of every person, to be and build beloved community. So maybe our readings today are all about stewardship after all. If we understand stewardship as understanding and reminding ourselves of who we are, then the example of both widows are examples of giving everything, giving all that we have and are to being who we say we are when we affirm our vows in the baptismal covenant. And in our reading today from Kings, we're reminded that giving our all in stewardship of who we are, is in being and building beloved community can open us to the abundance of God. So I'm wondering today, and perhaps you are too, how can we be better stewards of being who we are, of living our baptismal covenant, of being beloved community?